So welcome to another episode of the Arts First podcast, my first of 2025. I'm Wendy Earle, and my co-host and technical supremo, as ever, is Niall Crowley, and he's been holding the fort and doing some podcasts heroically while I've been on my travels. And those have been published recently, and hopefully you've had to listen to them. In this episode, we're delighted that playwright and actor David Ireland has agreed to join us and to talk to us about his work. David, I first met you during the COVID lockdown when you kindly agreed to do an online talk, Zoom event, a kind of precursor to the podcasts, which we just started again 6 months ago. We really enjoy your work and we're really delighted when you agreed to come back. You've managed to make a successful career out of writing quite edgy plays. And despite being, as far as I'm aware, being the very opposite of an arts world lovey. So we're quite curious about how you've managed that. By way of first a brief introduction to begin with, your newest play is starting in London fairly soon in the West End, The Fifth Step. It premiered in Glasgow last autumn, I think, and we did have a review of it on one of our first podcasts, so people can check back on that. And I'm very much looking forward to going to see it myself. But the tickets are selling out, so anybody who wants to see it, they should really get online and buy tickets soon. And you've also written recently your very own TV series called Lovers on Sky Atlantic, which Niall told me earlier today that he had watched a couple of episodes. I haven't got Sky Atlantic, but he's watched a couple of episodes and it's brilliant. And then you also have quite a number of plays now under your belt. Ulster American may be one that people recognise most because in London, the stars were two Hollywood stars, Woody Harrelson and Andy Serkis. You've also watched Cyprus Avenue, which is one of the first, I think it was the first play out by you that I ever saw. Yes, So I Said Yes, Sadie, Not Now, and others. And I think you have a great talent for using dark humour to expose conflict and contradiction. And, you make people laugh out loud while they're also cringing. And I found when I watched Cyprus Avenue and the reason why I wanted to interview over COVID, I saw it in 2019, it kind of quite sent me reeling because of your imaginative audacity in creating such hilariously horrific satire, surreal satire. So the first question I want to ask you is, what makes you write? How does a play get started?
I'm not sure, really. I think I usually just start writing the first 10 pages. I try to keep it as simple as possible, just have it as dialogue, usually between 2 or 3 people. I'm really inspired by David Mamet. He was one of my heroes. And when I read his plays when I was a teenager, it was just very simple. It was just usually 2 men in a room. It was usually men, 2 or 3 men in a room with snappy dialogue and lots of swearing and kind of macho. And I kind of liked all that. When I started writing, I just started to emulate him, and I've still sort of kept the same thing. I don't usually I'll just write 10 pages of dialogue, and it'll just be something, a word or a phrase that comes from somewhere. There's not necessarily an idea. And then I just let the dialogue take me over. And usually after 10 pages, I figure out whether or not there's a play there. Like Ulster American, for example, I wrote that when I had writer's block over something else I was writing. And I used to have this fear in my early days of writing. I used to have this fear that my talent would go away. And so whenever I experienced writer's block or I got stuck, I started writing something else just to prove to myself that I could still write. So Ulster American started like that many years ago. And I just wrote these 10 pages and then returned to it many years later. So often it's that. I also remember reading this biography of Harold Pinter by Michael Billington. And he said that Pinter always started with an image. And he said the idea for the caretaker came, he was walking along this street and he saw a homeless guy, he saw a tramp sitting in a doorway, and he was just completely taken by that image. And he thought, he couldn't get that image out of his head, and he just started with that image. And it's similar, I had with Cyprus Avenue, I had a similar thing. So Cyprus Avenue, as you'll know, is about an elderly man who believes his newborn baby granddaughter is Jerry Adams. And I just had this image of a baby with a beard on it. And I had this image of an old man sitting in a room, and then a toddler comes into the room, but it has the face and the glasses of Jerry Adams. and he looks at the kid really angry. And it just started from that image. I just thought that was a funny, interesting image. And so the play grew from there.
So does a lot of your plays do seem to have Northern Ireland and Belfast as a backdrop. Is that also kind of an inspiration for the ideas? When you start writing, do you often writing from that kind of background?
Yeah, well, that's not so much now. I mean, The Fifth Step, the play you're talking about that's going into the West End, that was a conscious attempt to try to get away from writing about Northern Ireland, because I've been writing about it for 10, 12 years now. But, you know, I grew up in Belfast. I grew up in a working class loyalist family during the Troubles, you know, in a dangerous area. So the Troubles kind of made their mark on me. I was fascinated by it. My mother tells me I used to sit at 6, 7 years old with the newspaper in front of me, the Belfast Telegraph, and I'd read every article out loud. And I think I had this fascination. There was no books in the house. I think that was like where I got, you know, where I was trying to reach for words, because we weren't really readers in my family. And I think I was really confused about why this conflict was going on, even at a young age. I was really confused about why we hated Catholics, why they were called Roman Catholics. Why don't they go back to Rome? Well, I had all these questions about why are the English not doing more to help us? Why are our neighbours trying to blow us up? I had all these questions and nobody could really provide me with satisfactory answers. So I was kind of fascinated by it from an early age. And so, yeah, then when I started writing, I was 30, about 30 when I started writing, and I was living in Glasgow, and then I moved back to Belfast because I wanted to write about Belfast and I felt out of touch with what was going on there. So I moved back in with my mother at the age of 30, and I just started listening to people talking, just started listening to conversations, got into the rhythm of the accent again, and watching the news, kind of obsessively watching the news when I was there, picking up on what people were talking about. And that's kind of where Cyprus Avenue came from as well, you know. But I moved back to Glasgow, and now I've been back in Glasgow about 12 years, 13 years now. I find I just can't write about Northern Ireland anymore. I don't pay any attention to the news, especially the news from Northern Ireland. I would struggle to tell you who the Deputy First Minister is. So I felt like, well, no, I don't want to write about that anymore. I want to write about something else.
Is Fifth Step your first move in a different direction?
Not really my first, but it's the first. I feel like I would really like to stop writing about the Troubles and stop writing about Northern Ireland, because I've said everything I've had to say about it. Ironically, though, saying that, I'm finishing a play at the minute, which is set in Northern Ireland. That's going to be my last Northern Ireland play, although it's actually more about Israel and Palestine than about Northern Ireland. You know, it's a group of characters in Belfast, in Ballygowan, who are kind of obsessed with Israel and Palestine. When I was growing up in Belfast, I used to hate it when anybody in the public eye would mouth off about Belfast. Me and my family would kind of go, well, what does he know? He doesn't even live here. And I'd hate to be that kind of person, you know. So I don't want to have people in Belfast talking about me going, what does he know? He doesn't even live here. So that plays heavily on my conscience.
So just, I suppose I'd be really interested to see that play, you know, if it comes to life, because I imagine it's yet another controversial topic.
Yeah.
You might find difficult to get a producer for.
Well, there's already a producer attached and they're interested. And if they're happy with this draft, they're going to produce it this year, hopefully. But yeah, you're right. It is a very contentious topic, but it came from a conversation with a Jewish friend of mine who had no idea that, see, where I grew up, Northern Irish Protestants Unionists are very pro-Israel, like aggressively pro-Israel. And so I grew up with that as well. And I found it funny when I moved to Scotland and when I started working in London, when I started meeting Jewish people in London had no idea that the loyalist people of Ulster were on their side, you know, that they were very pro-Israel. And I thought that was kind of funny. And my Jewish friend thought there's a really interesting idea for a play there. So yeah, I'm sort of writing about that, my experiences of growing up in a very pro-Israel family. And still, you know, I mean, it's interesting when you're writing about something like that, you know, in the midst of that being on the news so much and being so much a topic that people are obsessing over. And it's kind of about how we all obsess about Israel and Palestine, and how everybody sort of views the world through that lens a lot of the time. And a lot of people do it from a position of real ignorance, including myself a lot of the time. I was struck by when October the 7th happened, I couldn't find anybody in the arts, any actor or playwright or whatever, who would say, gosh, isn't this terrible? Isn't this awful? Then when Israel responded, everybody was up in arms. And I thought, well, hang on, how come you never mentioned October the 7th? And having grown up in this very pro-Israel family, being very alert to anti-Semitism in the theatre, like people who are very, very progressive, very politically correct, who would not tolerate any sort of attack on any other minority, would say the most outrageously anti-Semitic things and not even realize they were saying them. And I thought, well, all that's very interesting. But as I'm writing the play, what I was kind of hoping would be a satire about that kind of showbiz knee-jerk reaction to Israel, Palestine, and Gaza. As I'm writing the play, I'm finding it's funnier and sharper and more interesting and dramatic the more I center on the central character who's a unionist who's very pro-Israel but very ignorant about Israel, And it's kind of like I'm going against my own politics, which is kind of what I did with Cyprus Avenue. People thought Cyprus Avenue was this terrific satire about loyalism, and people who were very Republican took the view that it's a commentary on Brexit, and it's about, Ulster unionist intransigence and all that. I never intended it to be that way at all. I was kind of when I started Cyprus Avenue, my attitude was, I'm going to I feel like people don't really understand Ulster loyalism, so I'm going to explain it. And then it became this sort of wild, grotesque, absurdist satire, which seemed to be anti-loyalist. So there's a thing, one of my heroes is Anthony Nielsen, a fantastic playwright. And he said something about, a quote from him, what's best for your play isn't necessarily what's best for your career. It's like you have to, if you're doing it right, if you're approaching it like a real artist and a real playwright, the play and the characters in the story has to take precedence over your politics or your message. And so the way I see it is you have to serve the art first rather than the politics or the ideology. So I'm kind of potentially sacrificing my own politics in this play to write a much better play that will entertain people more and excite people more. And I find that's the opposite of what, I don't want to criticize my competitors, but I find that's the opposite of what a lot of playwrights do these days. They tend to put their politics first.
Don't you worry then that with something like how polarized it is around the whole kind of Israel situation, and how much, for example, as you say, the arts world seems to be so uncritically behind the Palestinian cause and, appears, even if they don't think they are, it certainly appears to be supporting Hamas. Are you not worried that taking that approach could get you into trouble with people that you feel like you don't want to be in trouble with, i.e. people you agree with?
Yeah, but that's always an issue. That's always a problem, and that's always a risk you have to take. I like taking risks, and really, I sort of feel like people should not take it so seriously, and it's just a play, and they shouldn't drag their own personality into it. I think everybody just needs to be a lot less easily offended. And if it sounds like you'd be offended, they just don't come and see it. It amazes me the amount of people in the industry who go to the theatre deliberately to be offended. They want to show their disapproval of something.
So just on the other side then, what's your approach? Do you kind of do any self-censor, or do you just ramp it up the more you feel something might are you there to try and push buttons? Do you see yourself trying to push a few buttons?
I think people see me that way, but I don't see myself that way at all. Again, with this play, I'm finding that, and I think maybe this is more that I'm changing a little bit as a writer, that what the play is actually about, obviously it will be marketed about that it's about Israel and Palestine, and people will bring that into it and it'll create controversy just by its subject matter. But really for me, the play is just about how much politics dominates our lives at the minute, our friendships and our relationships and our family relations, and how polarizing everything is and how hard it is to talk about anything. I've got family members who would, and friends who would disagree with me about an issue like Israel. And I just know that if we talked about it, it could get very ugly. It could get very passionate. It could get very heated. And I don't like that kind of conversation. I like everybody to get along. Ironically, considering how controversial my plays are, I don't like controversy at all. I like everybody to get along, and I don't really like arguing with people. In fact, I hate it. So yeah, I suppose I sort of get off my all of that out on the page rather than in my personal life, because you can kind of control it on the page, whereas you can't control it when you're sitting around the dinner table. And it's sort of, to do that with this play, you kind of have to recognize the humanity of all the characters, you know, and not play anybody. It's not really a satire. I thought it was going to be a satire, but, you know, to emphasize the humanity of the characters and how hard it is for all of the characters to be in a situation at a dinner table where they have these close relationships with people, they love these people, but they cannot talk about politics without it becoming a huge fight. I think it's terrible. It's one of the worst things I hate about living in the times we're living in.
I really agree with you. Yeah. Niall, did you say that?
It made me think of the play that we saw last week, basically centered on the debates around what's going on in Israel-Palestine at the moment, set in Florida with a Jewish family and visitors from Israel. And it was kind of a comedy drama, but for me, and I think probably for you a little bit as well, it was a little bit too much like a debate. I kept thinking, why don't you just have a debate here? And you, when you're saying about explaining, you don't do that, do you? I mean, I like what you said about sacrificing your views for the art. That's the most important. I mean, for me, it seems that everything I've seen by you just constantly keep throwing in grenades, if you like, to throw people. You're never preaching what you do. You know, it's like you're not trying to explain conflicts. Is that just something that comes natural to your work?
I think so, yeah. I don't enjoy plays that are preachy, and I don't like preachiness. I was thinking about this the other night because I was watching a Netflix drama that my wife was watching, and I noticed it was a courtroom drama. I think it was called Anatomy of a Scandal or something. And I noticed David E. Kelly's name in the credits. And I love David E. Kelly, you know, LA Law and Boston Legal and all that. I love a good courtroom drama. I thought, okay, this might be good. And as I'm watching it, I just watched the first couple of episodes, and I hate criticizing other people, but I'm going to do it. Hopefully they won't hear this. It's centered around a rape case and a Tory MP, and it was clearly meant to be, you know, the sort of Bullington Club, David Cameron, Boris Johnson kind of thing. And I was watching and think, well, the only way this is going to end is that he is going to be a rapist. And it's very much saying that posh Tories are all, you know, selfish rapists, you know. And I thought, there's nothing surprising in that. That doesn't interest me. I know I've heard this story before. There may be some truth in it, but I'm not interested in it. And then I ended up, as I often do when I'm disappointed with something modern, I go back to an old movie, and I put on From Dusk Till Dawn, which is one of my favorite movies of all time. Quentin Tarantino's screenplay, Robert Rodriguez directed it. And I hadn't seen it for a while. And the first scene, you know, there's this conversation between a clerk in a shop and a local sheriff, and they're talking about a kid who's working in a local, who's serving food, who I think has Down syndrome or something, and they're talking about how he shouldn't be allowed to serve food, and they're using words like retard and potato head and all this. And then George Clooney and Quentin Tarantino turn up with guns with 2 female hostages. They blow the place up. The women are completely faceless. The women are, I don't even think you see the women's faces. You don't, after everybody's dead, you don't find out what happened to the women. And of course, it's brilliant. As I'm watching it, I'm thinking, oh, I should write something like this. And like, first of all, if you did write something like that, nobody would produce it, you know? And also, if somehow you did manage to get it produced, that conversation using words like retard would be seen as deliberately provocative. You know, it would be seen as a political statement, as a kind of anti-woke thing, instead of just a conversation to two men. Now, when I saw that movie in the 90s or whenever it was, I just watched it as a conversation, a believable conversation between 2 men, you know? And I suppose what I'm getting at is that it's one of the hardest things about writing at the minute is there's no way to escape politics, because whatever you write now is seen through the lens of politics. Everybody's so heavily politicized. And every producer, every audience member views things through a political lens. Somebody, I think it was in The Spectator, somebody wrote a column saying, in the future, all plays will be woke or anti-woke. And I feel that's kind of true. I think we might be approaching that stage, because I think everybody is forced to take a position, you know, even with The Fifth Step. The Fifth Step was an attempt to avoid politics completely. I didn't want to write anything political, But because we live in these times, everybody was talking about, oh, it's two men talking, it's about toxic masculinity, it's about Andrew Tate and all that. None of that was on my mind. I was just writing about my own life experience.
So one of the things I was actually going to ask you about kind of relates to what you're saying, which was in one of the interviews you gave, I think in relation to the fifth step, is about this problem of the world being, what was it, that belief versus ideology, the kind of conflict. You see there's a conflict between belief and ideology. And I was wondering what you meant by that, because one might say that belief and ideology are kind of not exactly the same things, but they overlap.
Well, it's funny you should say that, because I did say that in the interview, and then when I read it back, I thought, what on earth does that mean? I think I said the wrong word. I think I was trying to say something ideology versus something else, and it came out wrong. But I didn't, whatever it was I meant to say, it wasn't that, because yes, belief and ideology are the same thing.
It struck me there was something to it about, there is a sort of thing about ideology being something that has become, at least, very fixed. And what you were saying earlier about, kind of some things just become beyond discussion, which shouldn't be beyond this discussion, but they are. And they're very difficult to discuss. I mean, I have in my family, I just find things really difficult to have a discussion about now, because you don't want to end up in an awful row that's never going to be resolved. And yet you feel then you're also missing the opportunity to clarify things or to persuade somebody to change their mind. Kind of, I have certain beliefs about that, which I do think are a little bit more loose, not fuzzy necessarily, but they're sort of open to adjustment. Whereas kind of at some level, there seems to be ideology these days, which kind of isn't open to adjustment. I don't know whether that was what you were getting at, maybe.
Yeah, I think at the time, maybe I was talking about Christianity, because I was talking about becoming a Christian, which is something that's happened recently to me.
I read that as well, completely separately. I picked up on that, and I've been thinking about it as well. And I think what you said about politics made me think that maybe it's that what passes for politics and ideology is something that's just very, very ossified, is something that's kind of increasingly off limits to us to really play with and think about. We grew up in very political times, you especially. So maybe I was thinking, is it a time where faith is something that's actually a little bit more important to us? I was really curious what you said about Christianity, because at the moment I'm looking into Catholicism, which is something that's a complete surprise to me, and I was very interested in what you were saying.
Well, it's interesting that I found more and more people, especially people in the arts, are heading in that direction. There seems to be more and more people going back to church, more and more people reading the Bible, and that's happened since 2020. That's when it happened to me in 2020. I was kind of amazed, Wendy, when you said we last spoke in 2020, because it felt more recent than that, and that was such a weird time, very weird time, and we don't talk about it. I mean, this is another interesting thing that maybe we can talk about, just talking about the lockdown and the COVID times. I find I'm writing increasingly about that. Like, this Israel-Palestine play touches upon that. And I've written a new play, which is, again, it's a play that's very political. I wrote it in 2023, and it's about all sorts of big political themes like anti-Semitism and the lockdown and masks and theatre's response to that. And it's and in the play, one of the central characters keeps saying, he's an actor and he's in the dressing room, and he keeps saying all the time, why does everything have to be so political? Can't we go back to when theatre was just putting on a pair of tights and mincing around and having a laugh? And so it's a political play, but it's a very anti-politics play. And the thing about the lockdown, I find that for me, it was the most extraordinary time, because I was very much against it from pretty early doors. I think I read an article by Peter Hitchens, and I thought, I think everybody seemed to be supporting it. And I thought, I think Peter Hitchens has this right. I don't often think that, but I thought, I think Peter Hitchens has this right. I don't think we're going to get out of this as quickly as we think we will. And everybody was so trusting of the state. And I thought, it's very strange how everybody, especially everybody in theatre, is so right behind this. And I noticed as well when I said, obviously we don't know what this COVID thing is and might be very dangerous, but aren't we worried about the long-term effects of this? And people looked at me like I was crazy. Like, how can you even be thinking about that? So being on the outside of society in that regard was a very strange and difficult time. And equally with masks, I found I couldn't wear a mask, and I found it really hard to see other people in masks. I really hated not seeing people's faces, and I couldn't breathe when I wore a mask. And when I told people this, they didn't believe me. They just thought, just grow up and put a mask on. And I couldn't get anybody to understand. And I didn't understand why I had such an extreme reaction to it, an extreme physical reaction to it. And then I found out, I sort of, I guess through writing a play, it took me about 2 years to figure out, I was connected to sort of deep trauma from childhood. And the thing is, it's like, it's been 5 years since those times, and nobody's really talking about it. And playwrights aren't really talking about it. And I think I've written 4 plays now, which either is directly about the lockdown and the response to COVID, or sort of mentions it a few times. And again, it's that thing of like, I don't want to impose my views on other people. I don't want to get up and preach and say, this is why the lockdown is wrong. It's interesting for me as an exercise to challenge myself and hear the other side of the argument and kind of go, well, this character disagrees, so what would he say? And it's healthy for me to express that. As you say, though, not in a sort of debating way, not because I don't think the debate, as you say, why not have a debate? Why have theatre at all? It's not really about, like with this play about Israel I'm writing, and this play about lockdown and theatre. It's about relationships between people and what politics has done to people, and the emotional, stuff between people when they debate, which has always been interesting, but I think it's really interesting in the times we're living in, and nobody's talking about it. I heard somebody who's very progressive say that a lot of the problems they're finding with young writers, this person ran a theatre, I can't remember who it was, but they said they're reading new plays, and they found that young playwrights find it very difficult to put the opposite point of view. They don't know what they want to. They want to give a character a voice, but they don't know what the other character would say because they don't understand what their uncle would say. They're writing a character based on their uncle. They don't know what he really believes, what he would really say. And I don't think that was a problem 20, 30 years ago. I think people, so many great playwrights were always good at writing the other side of the argument. And it's interesting that younger playwrights are finding that impossible now.
I suppose it's partly, you wonder, is it that they've been brought up with less exposure to the complex literature, even of Shakespeare? They see it's all very partially taught these days. So you don't necessarily read a whole book. You don't necessarily read a whole play. The level of education has gone down. I wonder how much it's to do with that, and how much it's to do with the identity thing, where you kind of are what you believe, and it's very hard to get out of kind of a little box you put yourself in. Well,
it's the personal is political, isn't it? That's what everybody thinks now. And that's why everybody approaches it.
I wanted to ask a bit more about your comedy. You obviously have some very serious things to say, but the way you go about writing it is a sort of like, you bring a situation to life that then turns out to be hilarious. Is it that you seek to be deliberately funny, or are the situations that you kind of put your characters in, they just become funny in a kind of organic way? I mean, I don't know how much you read your reviews, but I read a quote from an Australian Sydney Morning Herald. Playwright David Ireland challenges people to draw lines between what they find funny and what they find outrageous. Is that what you seek to do, or is that just one of those things that comes because you're writing what you write?
No, it's not something I seek to do. It's interesting that Australians seem to love my work more than anybody. It seems to be, my shows are always hits in Australia and seem to run forever. I should really go there someday. Yeah, it's a weird thing for me because I'm not a funny person, I very rarely say something funny in life. Occasionally I make my wife and kids laugh, but nobody else really. And I grew up in a family where everybody was very funny. My mother was hilarious. My sister's really funny. Their husbands were hilarious. I always hated how unfunny I was. And then when I started writing plays, I found I could write stuff that I didn't even think was that funny. I've seen shows of mine where I've seen people literally fall off their chairs laughing. And it's a complete mystery to me because a lot of the time I'm not intending to be funny. Sometimes I am. Sometimes I'll come up with a line and go, okay, that's going to kill them. But most of the time, a lot of time, people are laughing at things I never even intended to be funny. And yeah, it's a complete mystery to me why I seem to have this ability to be funny when I write dialogue. I feel like I have a lot of contradictory feelings and impulses, and sometimes I have quite extreme internal thoughts, and extreme internal thoughts of the opposite direction. And I guess when you put those down on paper in the voices of characters, it can be funny. But I've really no idea.
On that, I watched the first couple of episodes of your TV show yesterday. I didn't realise that there was one until Wendy pointed it out to me. So I watched the first couple, and at one point I had to stop and get my inhaler because I was laughing so much. And it didn't strike me as a comedy that was intended to be, you know, one of those kind of belly laugh things. And I think that some of your jokes, I mean, on the surface of it, it seems, you know, fairly conventional contemporary comedy, but you always get into your characters in a strange way. And I was thinking about some of the jokes. There's the female character, she ends up with this guy who's a big TV reporter who thinks more of himself than he is, and he's interviewing the foreign secretary, isn't he? And she doesn't know what the foreign secretary is, and she mishears him and thinks it's the farm secretary. And I think on paper that looks like a really crap joke. And I was thinking that must be very, very brave to take that too. I mean, it's absolutely brilliant. It's a really great piece. And there's so much like that you managed to bring to life. Seemingly quite simple things. They're very rarely obvious characters and very rarely obvious laugh, and that they catch you unaware.
With that show, with The Lovers, it was like, I love romantic comedies. And I love like anything like When Harry Met Sally or anything like that. I just adore. I always wanted to write one, but I can't really write anything straight. You know, there always has to be a kind of absurdist twist to it. And I mean, there is a twist coming. I won't ruin it for you or anybody else who wants to watch it, but there is a sort of twist in episode 5, which I don't think has ever been done in a romantic comedy before. In fact, I know it's never been done in a romantic comedy before. Again, like, I don't really know how it's done, but the thing that really bothers me is being boring. I don't ever want to be boring in my stuff, because as an actor, I was in so much stuff that was boring, and my family used to like travel from Belfast to see me in shows in Glasgow and Edinburgh where it was so boring, and they would think, what are we doing here? And I would think, why did I ask them to come and see this? And I think, you've got a live audience right here. Why don't you just go for the jugular? Why don't you keep things interesting? Why don't you have somebody say something that'll make everybody sit up? So when I started writing, that's what I did. And also it came from my background, like where I came from with my family, like a working class loyalist family. People just spoke very directly to each other. You know, there was no pussyfooting around. And I think that, I mean, it's a bit of a cliche, but I think it is true that Belfast people do speak like that. They're very direct and blunt. So I try to write like that too. Characters say what they mean. And I remember thinking as well, that's a bit like when I went to drama school, I loved Greek tragedy, and I really loved Roman tragedy, because Roman tragedy was even more violent. I loved the kind of bluntness of Greek tragedy and how short it was, and how people would just come on stage and say, I'm going to kill you, and then they'd stab someone. I liked the directness of that, and I thought, wow, that's the roots of theatre. It's like when Cyprus Avenue came out and everybody was very shocked by it, because it was so violent. You know, it ends with a really extremely violent scene. There's 3 really extremely violent murders in it. And I remember being shocked that people were shocked, because I thought, it's not like I invented violence. It's not like I'm the first writer to do this. Sarah Kane did it like 10 years before me. And before her, you know, Shakespeare did plenty of. Titus Andronicus is one of the most violent plays ever written. And then right back to the Greeks, you know, there's nothing new in what I'm doing, but it seemed to really strike a chord with people at the time. People hadn't really seen violent theatre in London for about 10 years. And
yeah, I think that's
like, although I really like Sarah Kane, she's kind of humorless, you know, it was quite serious, her stuff. Whereas I think people were shocked by how violent and shocking it was, but also how funny it was.
I think that's what people enjoy about it, is that you laughing is cathartic, I suppose, but your characters are sympathetic. So there's the two things where it's not just pure violence. It is the absurdity of some of the situations you put your characters in, and it does work. So I think we have to start winding up, but I just wanted to give you a chance to say a bit more about your play that's coming up, The Fifth Step, that's coming up in London, so that we can encourage people to go and see it. Mm-hmm. Can you tell us a little bit more about what it's about and what?
Yeah, it was originally commissioned by the National Theatre of Scotland. In this version, it stars Jack Lowden and Martin Freeman. And it's really about 2 men. It's sort of based on my own experiences when I was a younger man, giving up alcohol and attending Alcoholics Anonymous. And it's really about a young man who's very troubled, played by Jack Lowden. He needs guidance, you know, he needs somebody to help him to stay sober. He needs somebody to help him through the steps. So in AA, they have this, you know, he asks someone to be your sponsor. So he asks this guy to be his sponsor and to take him through the steps. And things don't really go according to plan, mainly because the young man has an encounter with Jesus. And this maybe comes to the conflict between belief and ideology thing that I was trying to say. It becomes a sort of conflict. The play's about lots of things, but I think it's kind of about the conflict between AA and the 12 steps and Christianity, which is a conflict I've had in my own life. And it's also, it's about a lot of things. It's about men and young men. It's not about toxic masculinity, as a lot of people seem to want it to be about. I kind of find that phrase very tiresome. And what's interesting is that when you take a play to a theatre, I think this is changing, but it used to be 4 or 5 years ago, you know, there would be this real fear about what the play was saying and which minorities were going to be offended, and we had to make sure it wasn't offensive to any particular group. And I realized that it's interesting because a lot of people from my church came to see the play, and a lot of people I'd known. I don't go to AA anymore. I don't really believe in it, although I don't drink. But a lot of people I knew from AA came to see the play as well. And some people from AA really loved it. Some people from AA really hated it and found it, you know, they felt the play was guilty of misinformation, misleading people about alcoholism. Equally, some people from church really loved it and felt it was very truthful to their experience of Jesus. And other people felt like it was offensive and it was going to push people away from Christianity. And what I find interesting about that is that nobody in the theatre world, no producer really cared. Nobody cared about offending Christians. Nobody cared about offending alcoholics. You know, and I think that's partly why I wrote it, because this is a subject I can write about, and it's not going to get censored and it's not going to get banned. Because thankfully, you know, in fairness to the people from AA and the people from my church who hated it, they didn't complain to the theatre. They didn't complain to anybody. They took it on the chin, you know, and they said, well, it's not for me, but let people enjoy it. And I'd really like us to get back to that kind of society. And I think we are getting back there.
Hopefully. Well, with your plays, I'm looking forward to your next plays, and also hopefully more TV series from you, because The Lovers sounds brilliant, and I'm going to have to sign up to Sky Atlantic to get it.
Yeah. Well, I've got a TV series coming out in the autumn on ITV starring Andrew Lincoln, and it's called Cold Water, and it's a thriller.
Yeah, I think so. Oh, that'll be fun. Good.
It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you. It's been lovely talking to you.
Yeah, it was really, really interesting talking to you as ever, David. And I'm going to keep my eye out for other productions of yours. I'm obviously a big fan, so I don't know how many of us there are, but I suspect there's more than one.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Yeah.
Been lovely talking to you.
Thanks for listening to Arts First. You can subscribe and listen to all of our episodes at our Substack website, and you can find that at artsfirst.uk, or you can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or on our YouTube channel. Please give us a like or review us on any of those channels. That would be a great help. If you'd like to help with donations, then please see our Substack donations page. We'll see you next time.